So research methods, year 1, so the experiments and non-experimental methods. So what do you need to know for your AS exams? You need to know about experimental designs and experimental methods. It's important you don't get those two confused in the exam. The observations and observational techniques. Self-report, that refers to questionnaires and interviews. Questionnaires, how we construct them and how we design interviews. Correlation and ethical guideline. So our experimental methods, they are the ways in which we carry out an experiment. So we can have a lab experiment. This usually takes place in a special facility, so a lab, within a university psychology department. All the variables have been controlled. So the independent variable is directly manipulated by the researcher, and its effect on the dependent variable is directly measured. Any extraneous variables are controlled as much as possible. So the strengths of a lab experiment is it has strict controls, and its well-documented procedures means that it can be replicated, which can increase the reliability. So we have high internal validity and high reliability. We can control extraneous variables, which means that we can confidently assume cause and effect. However, the artificial nature of the research means that participants do not demonstrate real-life behaviour, so we have low ecological validity. Also, due to the strict controlled nature, it may be possible that demand characteristics are likely, so participants may work out the nature of the research which could influence the way that they behave. Field experiments are the same as a lab experiment in terms of the direct manipulation of an independent variable. However, it takes place within a real-life setting, so within a natural environment, such as a school, town, centre or a hospital. So the ecological validity is higher due to the real-world setting. Demand characteristics are reduced because the participants are unaware that they are taking part generally within a study. However, the researcher's control over the environment reduces in the real life world, so there's more extraneous variables that they can find difficult to control. And if the participants are unaware that they are taking part, then we may be having some ethological problems. So they may be distressed by the manipulations of the independent variables, and it is impossible to debrief them if we aren't able to get hold of them again. So you should have noticed that the strengths and weaknesses were reversed for a lab experiment and for a field experiment. So that should reduce the amount that you need to know. A natural experiment. Please do not confuse a natural experiment with a field experiment. In a natural experiment, the researcher doesn't manipulate the independent variable. It has naturally occurred. They measure the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. So examples can include the effects of child abuse on adult relationships, or the effects of anorexia nervosa on cognitive development. So the researcher hasn't manipulated the independent variable. They haven't made someone have anorexia in order to measure if it affects cognitive developments. They have taken advantage of the participant having anorexia and measuring their cognitive development. So the strengths are it allows research to investigate topics that would be impractical or unethical to investigate. So it would be unethical to induce a brain damage into somebody to test whether damage to the basal ganglia affects OCD or influences OCD. So we have to only have participants that have had damage. Ecological validity is high. The researcher has no control over the environment. Extraneous variables are great, so that reduces the validity of the results, and it's often impossible to replicate the research to test whether the findings are reliable or not. Quasi-experiments. Okay, so again, please don't get these confused with natural experiments. Quasi, again, the researcher doesn't manipulate the independent variable. The independent variable already exists, so it could be gender, age, or socio-economic background. So it's impossible for me to make someone male or female. That is a variable that's already pre-existing. So the researcher can't randomly allocate the participants into the conditions or the groups because they are already in the groups to start with. Strengths are that it's often carried out under controlled conditions and therefore cause and effects could be established. It's easy to replicate due to the controls of extraneous variables. However, as the researcher can't randomly allocate the participants to each condition because they're already in those conditions, any individual difference of participant variables could affect the results. Experimental designs. Don't get these confused with experimental methods. The designs refer to how participants are put into the conditions. So remember the acronym RIM to help you remember. We have repeated measures, independent groups and matched pairs. So repeated measures is where the same participants are used in both conditions. So each participant takes place in all of the conditions. So this reduces any individual differences because they're taking part in all of the conditions. So any individual differences do not affect the results. However, because participants experience both conditions, order effects such as fatigue or practice effects could affect the results. However, one way that we can overcome order effects is to use counterbalancing. So half of the participants will take part in the first condition A first, followed by condition B, then the other half will take part in condition B first, followed by condition A. Independent groups, so different participants are placed into each condition. So each participant only takes part in one condition. They should be randomly allocated into each condition to reduce any extraneous variables, any participant variables. However, if it's a quasi-experiment, those groups may be already pre-existing. So order effects are reduced because they only take part in one condition, and because they are in one condition, we might have individual differences. So the results could be down to participant variables rather than manipulation of the independent variable. So you should notice that the strength of one is the weakness of the other and vice versa. So that should help you reduce the amount of information that you need to learn for your exam. Matched pairs are where different participants are used in each condition, like in independent groups, but they are matched on key variables to form in a pair. So each pair is classed as one person, one participant, because they're matched on certain characteristics, such as age, gender, IQ, race. So order effects are reduced because they're only taking part in one condition, and the process of matching is difficult, so it's very time consuming and expensive in comparison to other conditions such as repeated measures or independent groups. Observations. An observation is where behaviour is watched and recorded. We can have participant and non-participant. So participant is when the observer also participates and joins in with the group or situation they're observing. So this generates rich qualitative data. However, the data can be subjective if the researcher becomes too involved. Non-participant is when the researcher observes from a distance, so they don't get involved with the group or the situation. So the observer can be more objective, as they're less likely to get emotionally involved with the participants. However, the actual meaning of the data might not be that clear from a distance, so we might not actually be sure of why they are behaving the way that they are. Naturalistic versus controlled. A naturalistic observation is when everything is left how it would normally be. So the environment is unstructured, uncontrolled. So, for example, if I was observing childhood aggression in the playground, I'd leave the playground exactly how it was and I'd observe the children within the natural setting. It has high ecological validity, therefore findings can be applied to other situations. However, there's no control over extraneous variables, so it reduces the internal validity of the results, and the conclusions that may be drawn from my findings may be inaccurate. Controlled observations, so the variables are controlled by the researcher. So if you think back to the strange situation, that was a controlled observation. The environment was controlled. Each mother and child were observed in the same environment. So a high level of control over the extraneous variables reduces any confounding variables. However, there is low ecological validity as the behaviour is not in its natural setting. So once again, strength of one is the weakness of the other. The third type of observation you can get is covert and overt. So we think of a covert operation, they're undercover. So a covert observation is when people are observed without their knowledge. So hidden cameras or one-way mirrors. So remember, it begins with a C, so it's covered. They aren't aware. Participants are unaware they're being observed, so there's less demand characteristics, so their behaviour is more likely to be natural. However, there are ethical issues due to lack of informed consent, or there may be deception. Overt, so we can say that O is in the open, so participants are aware that they are being observed. Ethical issues are reduced because they know that they are being observed, so they can give informed consent. And a weakness of that is that they may change their behaviour because they know that they are being observed, so it weakens the validity of the research finding. So you need to be aware about how you can design observations. So behavioural categories is an attempt to overcome the ambiguity of a behaviour. So we operationalise the behaviour into smaller categories. So we generally produce a behaviour checklist so the observer knows what to look for. So for example, if we're interested in measuring aggression in the playground, aggression would be broken down into smaller categories such as hitting, kicking, punching, pushing, swearing, biting, etc. And each time that behaviour is displayed, it is counted by producing a tally for each of those behaviours. Okay, you also need to be aware about event and time sampling. Do not get this confused with sampling techniques. If you see sampling techniques in relation to an observation, it means time and event sampling, not how you sample your participants like random volunteer opportunity. So please make sure you read the question carefully. Event sampling involves recording the number of times that a certain behaviour, the event, occurs while you are observing an individual. So how often a pupil puts their hand up in a lesson, I would record the amount of times that my pupil puts their hand up in a lesson. So I'm tallying the amount of times, I'm generating quantitative data. Time sampling records the behaviours within a time frame. So I might record what a participant does every 60 seconds. They could select one or more behaviours from a checklist. So observing a pupil within a lesson, and I record what behaviour they are doing at every 5-minute intervals within the lesson. So I don't record what they're doing for the entire lesson, I just record what behaviour they are doing at the 5-minute intervals. Self-report methods then, this refers to questionnaires and interviews. So a questionnaire allows participants to directly provide information about themselves. They consist of a set of pre-written questions that can be printed and given to participants either face-to-face, or they can be posted to them, completed over the internet, or left in public places, or published within newspapers and magazines. The questions can be broad, or using their own words, so open questions, or they can be narrower, so using closed questions. Generally, they're highly replicable because it's easy to produce the procedures for all participants, and it can be repeated at future dates. They are time and therefore cost efficient, so a large sample of participants can be reached quickly and easily, so a large amount of data can be gained, which is a strength. People may modify their answers, so social desirability bias. They will want to present themselves in the best light, therefore they might not answer the questions truthfully, so that reduces the validity. Also, the researchers aren't always present, so therefore they're unable to ask for help if there are any unclear questions. So interviews. Here the researcher asks participants questions verbally about the topic being researched, and it's usually face-to-face. You need to be aware about structured and unstructured. A structured interview is where the interviewer has a set of pre-written questions. They have an interview schedule. So all of the participants are asked the same questions in the same order. They do not deviate from those questions. In an unstructured interview, the interviewer has the general question in mind, but there are no set questions. Instead, there is flexibility to pick up on an issue or ask participants to expand on their responses, or questions may follow on from the responses generated by the interviewee. Because the researcher is present, any interesting issues or misunderstandings can be followed up. So if the participant isn't aware of what the question is asking, the interviewer can word it so it's not so ambiguous. Lots of rich data is gathered compared to questionnaires because there are fewer constraints in place, particularly in an unstructured interview. Again, there is social desirability. Participants may be dishonest in how they're answering results because they want to portray themselves in the best light possible. And also there can be low interrelated reliability between interviews of the same participant due to interviewer effects of age, gender, ethnicity and personality. So you need to be careful about which interviewer and participants you are interviewing. So we need to know about how we would design them. So how do we write good questions in the first place? So we need to avoid any jargon within our questions. So we should keep the questions as simple as possible. We should avoid any double-barreled questions. So that's where there's two questions in one. So for example, do you agree that footballers are overpaid and they should give 20% of their wages to charity? So that's two questions in one. So to avoid this, you should just be have, do you think that footballers are overpaid? ? Do you think they should give money, their wages to charity? ? So that needs to be separated into different questions. You need to avoid any leading questions. So the above example is a leading question, and so is the one below. Do you agree that boxing is barbaric? So instead you should word it in a way that is less leading. So what do you think about boxing? Or is boxing barbaric? Not do you agree? You can have open questions, so they provide their own answers in words. So it produces qualitative data. So why did you start smoking? Generally, the data is more detailed. However, it can be difficult to analyse. Closed questions, they have a limited choices. So it's either yes or no responses or a tick box. So data is quantitative. How many cigarettes do you smoke a day? 0 to 10, 11 to 20, etc. Or it could be a Likert scale. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how strongly do you feel about psychology? 1 being not strongly at all, 10 being very strongly. So it's easier to analyse, but the responses generated are less detailed. Designing an interview then, you need to have an interview schedule. So a standardised list of questions that the interviewer needs to cover. So that reduces any interviewer bias. A quiet room, so that increases the likelihood that the interviewee will open up. So rapport needs to be generated, so generally begin with neutral questions to make sure the participant feels relaxed. And you need to be ethical, so you need to remind interviewees that all answers will be treated in confidence, they'll be kept confidential. Also, you can, with interviews and questionnaires, include a lie question, okay, to test whether participants are lying in their future questions, so to reduce any chances of social desirability. Correlation. So a correlational analysis is a statistical technique that is used for assessing the strength of the relationship between two variables, and it tells us the direction of that relationship. So analysis will either have a positive correlation, a negative correlation, or zero correlation. So a positive correlation, as one variable increases, so does the other. A negative correlation, as one variable increases, the other decreases. They are covariables because they are naturally occurring. They're not an independent and dependent variable. They are just covariables. So they're very different to an experiment. Correlations can be illustrated through a scatter graph and numerically, so through correlation coefficients. So a correlation coefficient ranges from -1 to +1. So the sign tells us the direction of the relationship, and the number indicates the strength of the relationship. So correlations are quite useful, and they tell us the direction and the strength of the relationship between the covariables. So for example, -1 is a very strong negative correlation, but if we had -0.2, that'd be a relatively weak negative correlation. +1 is a very strong positive correlation. If we had +0.1, we've got a relatively weak positive correlation. So the closer it is to 1, the stronger the correlation, and the closer it is to 0, the weaker the correlation. Correlational analysis allows researchers to investigate topics that would be impractical or unethical to investigate. It's a precise method. It can tell researchers the exact strength and direction. However, it's impossible to establish cause and effect between the variables. So we can't say that stress increases the likelihood of a person becoming ill. We can just say that there is an association between the variables. It could be that because a person is ill, they're more likely to feel stressed. We can only measure linear relationships. We can't measure any curved linear relationships. And inaccurate conclusions can be commonplace. So the media or policymakers may infer something different than what is really there. So that could lead to ethical implications, so misuse of data. Ethics. So to help you remember the ethical guidelines, remember can do, can't do with participants. So can refers to our consent. They need informed consent. So participants should always agree to take part in the study. They're told the true nature of the experiment, the aims, the procedure and the purpose of their role, and whether they agree to take part. So how do we deal with informed consent? We provide them with a consent form. So you may be asked in the exam to write a consent form. So you need to include the aim of the experiment or research, the purpose of their role, the procedure that they'll have to do, so what they will be asked to do. Remind them that they have the right to withdraw and their data will be kept confidential. Give them a chance to ask any questions, so do you have any questions, and then a place for them to sign. Debrief. Participants are informed of the true nature of the research, in particular if there's been deception in any way. Again, you may be asked to write a debrief form in the exam. So here you need to tell them the aim of the experiment, what the procedure was. In particular, if you had an independent group design, you have to inform them what the other group had to do as well. So it could be, during this experiment, you were asked to do this. Participants in the other condition were asked to, and you'd have to give them a detailed indicator of what they had to do, what the purpose of the study was. If they have any questions regarding the experiment, particularly if they may have been distressed, you may need to make sure that they are returned back to the original state, so offer them counselling. And you remind them that they still have the right to withdraw data and their data will be kept confidential. The next C then, confidentiality. So any information must be kept private. So the report won't reveal any information about them or their data. It won't be identified or linked to them. So they will be remained anonymous. To deal with this ethical issue, you should use codes, so numbers for participants rather than participants' names. It shouldn't be obvious who the participant is from the data collected. D, deception. You should not withhold any information from the participant or mislead them so that they take part. Obviously, some experiments do require deception, because if you told them the true nature of the experiment, it may lead to demand characteristics. So with a lot of research in social influence, we did have to deceive participants. So Milgram had to deceive his participants, and so did Ash. So to deal with deception, you should fully debrief them at the end. Withdrawal: participants should be allowed to leave the research at any point if they feel like it. They shouldn't be made to finish a study, and that the data can be removed from the research and destroyed even afterwards. Okay. Protection from harm: psychologists have a responsibility to protect their participants from physical and emotional harms. They should not be exposed to any more risk than what they would do in everyday life. So this is where the ethics committee will try to judge whether there'll be any harm in their experiment, and if there is any unforeseen harm, then they should be debriefed, offered counselling to restore them back to their state before the experiment.